have cast away, but blessed he that stirs them not, and lets the kind worm take the lot.
It's a bit like Shakespeare's Epitaph.
It's entirely,
and
it's a Stratford edition, of course.
Yes, of course.
But the irony, I confess, I become dizzy as I contemplate the ironies of this, because this too was never reprinted.
No, I certainly. This is the first time I've heard that.
So, by what right then are we stirring it? No.
Don't go there.
You see, is the interdiction's force lessened or not by this? And I don't know the answer. No. But yes, it is Shakespearean, indeed, and designedly so.
Yeah.
And Geoffrey, you were talking about self and how complicated self is in the remaking.
Yes.
And of course, Yeats was given to saying the occasional thing about this. Yeats's most successful book was not as one might think, The Tower or The Winding Stair, but commercially the successful book was a book called Poems, which first appeared in 1895, but went into numerous editions all the way through to the late 20s. And each time it would go into a new edition, it would be in danger of receiving further revisions, textually, or indeed further prefaces, altered prefaces. Yeah. Some of these are fascinating. He says, I think it's as early as 1899, and remember, this is a very young poet. This is a man who was born in 1865, saying, he speaks of himself in the third person. Says the writer revised and to a great extent rewrote the wanderings of a Sheen and certain lyrics and ballads from the same volume. And he has still further revised these and other poems in the present edition. Having said that, he adds a promissory or a threatening note that says other revisions are necessary. And he hopes to make them but this is what interests me, he hopes to make them when he is further from the mood in which the poems were written.
Very important. It's a very, very important phrase.
Further from the mood.
And in fact, an entire course of lectures could burgeon from that one sentence. Because it immediately brings into confrontation a popular sense of what the function of poetry is, and the poet's own growing sense as he thinks about his oeuvre, the poet's own growing sense that there will be an inevitable diremption sooner or later, and sooner probably rather than later, between the popular assumption of what the function of poetry is and his own sense of what the purpose of poetry is. Yeah. And the purpose becomes even more polemical as he goes on. But I immediately want to say, it'd be so easy to be misunderstood in one's use of that word polemical. The great triumph of Yeats is to be simultaneously highly polemical and heartbreakingly lyrical within 3 or 4 lines. Whereas even with a young poet I admire, that is to say, the young W.H. Auden, or the early middle-aged Auden, the lyricism and the politics don't always go together quite as effectively as they do in Yeats. I mean, you have the wonderful personal lyrics, "Lay you sleeping head, my love, human on my faithless arm," and you have polemic, but not seen as part of the inevitable complex of an intelligent human being situated in the early and middle years of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Having said that, I see that you have printed a poem on the back, which I think is one of the least effective of Yeats's poems.
Politics, this is.
Yeah.
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 I yield, I revere Yeats. I think of all the 20th century poets writing in English, he is perhaps the greatest. But if I have a few Yeats poems I care less about, it is this one.
Yeah, and we might. I hesitate to say that's why it's there, but that's why it's there, in a way, because I thought we might approach that later. But just to stay on this before we move into some of these poems, just to stay on the subject of revisions, Yeats could, in public, say interesting things like this. I mean, that book, Poems, goes on to 1912. By the time of the 1912 edition, he says, I have, as though an apology, I have not again retouched the lyric poems of my youth, fearing some stupidity in my middle years, which seems to be enormously self-aware.
I don't know.
Fearing some stupidity in my middle years.
It also requires a tremendous amount of self-confidence to say that, of course.
Yes.
You only say things like that when you know you've got the audience eating out of your hand.
That's right. He carries on, though. I mean, as the years go by, and I suppose as he moves out of his middle years, so that by 1927, he's saying this volume contains what is, I hope, the final text of the poems of my youth. And yet it may not be, seeing that in it are not only the revisions from my book published last year, but quite new revisions on which my heart is greatly set. One is always cutting out the dead wood.
Hardy says things not unlike that, you know. I mean, Hardy writes little prefaces to the very late, to 3 late volumes. Each has an interesting preface, if I remember rightly. And Hardy says things like, I am coming to the end of, quite clearly coming to the end of my writing life, and as I look back, etc., etc. So it's not that kind of preface where your modesty at the same time implies that you know you're a kind of national figure or international figure. Yeats does it very well, but it's not unique to Yeats.
I wonder, though, about the metaphor, the dead wood. I mean, that's to say one can push it a bit. Is this dead wood that once was living? Is Yeats contemplating? He keeps using this phrase, the poems of my youth. Is he contemplating poetry that was living and is now something other than living?
Living under a different dispensation,
No.
I would have thought. Yeats is very conscious of moving into and under a new dispensation. I think in the middle poetry. He raises questions in the notes from the 1930 diary, which I refer to because I just happen to have read it fairly recently. He talks there about the problem of intergrafting the personal and the public voice. How to make the voice public without losing its individual validity and resonance. I mean, in a way, what is more interesting for us, I think, is to consider how Yeats in the
have cast away, but blessed he that stirs them not, and lets the kind worm take the lot.